Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. I have an award winning documentarian with me, Jen Senko, who did an amazing documentary that came out years ago called The Brainwashing of My Dad, which I watched and I loved, Jen, and we talked. And you have a book that is also award winning, I believe. And I've seen you on Joy Reid, on MSNBC, and people are starting to pay more attention to your book and your documentary. And if you haven't seen it yet, please check it out. And I kind of want to say what's in it, but I rather let you describe it as the filmmaker because it was about your dad. It was a
Yeah,
very personal story, but you really
yeah,
educate the listeners and your readers
yeah.
about the right wing directed assault to
Mm-hmm.
promote disinformation and
Yeah.
polarize,
That's-
etc. So, with that, I also want to say you won a Webby People's Voice Award in
Yeah.
public service and activism
Yeah.
uh, for the documentary. Good for you.
And that
And
was years later. So it's just weird.
so
It's
people need to watch this documentary. It's called The Brainwashing of My Dad. And Jen Senko, please share how this idea for the documentary evolved. Like, give our listeners, if they haven't seen
yeah,
you interviewed before.
yeah.
Uh,
First, I want to say I'm really happy to be here. I have read your book. I've read it twice, and and it's
Thank you.
got all different color markings in it. And wow,
Cool.
the second time I read it, it was even better. It's kind of mind blowing. I think you and I were sort of on the same path around the same time, and that's why you reached out to me, I think, initially.
Oh yeah. No,
Yeah,
I've been talking about the Moonies and the right wing, etc. And that's what your thing is about right wing media. I think
right.
of Fox, etc. Rush Limbaugh. But
Yeah,
when we
yeah.
first talked, I said the Moonies, the Washington Times. You're like, oh yeah, right. And the Moonies are still at it. Unfortunately, people think
Yeah,
it went away, but it didn't.
yeah. I had no idea. I think we're the exact same age, but so I remember them when I
Mm.
was like a teenager, and I
Uh
remember
huh.
people being attracted to that, and then some of us going, "Oh, what's that about?" But we never ran into one to in order to be able to influence us, like
Yeah,
you
you were
did. You
lucky.
actually, yeah, yeah. But so my story is an American story. Unfortunately, my
Mm-hmm.
story is it's what happened to my dad is a phenomenon. It's a it's like a cancer. It's like a disease. It's like a plague that has taken over America. I would venture to say one out of every six people has a story. Maybe it's one out of every five now. So what happened is my dad he retired and he got a part-time job with a really long commute. And on that commute, he didn't want to listen to music. He wanted to educate himself. So
Mm.
he didn't know. He listened to talk radio, and it was Bob Grant, one of the first
Oh
combat
yeah.
right wing guys, openly racist, openly sexist.
Mm.
Um, but my dad didn't know. Now he had been a World War II vet, had gotten his master's degree from the GI Bill,
Mm.
and he was a FDR Kennedy Democrat through and through. And sometimes they even say he was kind of like a prototype hippie because he was like, "Hey, whatever you want to do, it's fine
Mm.
with me. Just don't hurt yourself or anybody
Uh
else."
huh.
Um, and so when he started listening to Bob Grant, he did start changing
Mm-hmm.
a little bit. He came more combative and a little more critical of Democrats. And we were all Democrats. But then when he retired all the way, he would sit home and listen to, he discovered Rush Limbaugh.
Mm.
And he would listen to Rush Limbaugh all 3 hours a day. And my mother hated the sound of Rush Limbaugh. So my dad built these really heavy doors on the kitchen to
Mm.
separate the kitchen from the living room.
Interesting.
Yeah, sliding doors, and he would sit there with his beer and belch and listen to Limbaugh. It was his routine.
And if I can say, Rush Limbaugh was Michael Pence's mentor, I remember, and
Oh,
Trump
really?
gave him like a big award while he was president, Rush
That's
Limbaugh,
that's
right?
right. Mike Pence, our former VP,
Yeah,
was a radio host, not as bombastic. I mean, let's face it, he's kind of a boring dude, you know.
yeah,
So he wasn't as colorful as Limbaugh, but he learned a lot from him.
right.
Yeah.
But your dad was negatively impacted by listening to hours and hours of Rush Limbaugh. Please continue in the story.
Yeah, very much so. And it was odd. His personality changed. You
Mm-hmm.
know, he'd always been sort of happy go lucky, and he became angry all the time and
Mm-hmm.
very argumentative. And everything was about politics. Like, you couldn't say anything without him making it political. But then the big thing was Democrats. He started hating Democrats. And, you know, he also became racist, which I'm embarrassed to say,
Mm.
um, and especially against illegal aliens, which is interesting because he spoke about 7 different languages, and he would
Wow.
love to go up to different people because he grew up speaking English, Polish, and Ukrainian. My grandfather had a lot of wives, so
Interesting.
yeah. So and then when he went in the war, he was used to, he tried to pick up all those languages. Anyway,
Right.
he would talk to anybody, but
Right.
after that, if he suspected they were an illegal immigrant, he didn't want to talk to them. So then he met another Rush Limbaugh guy. It was his buddy, and they just crushed over Rush Limbaugh like two
Mm.
schoolgirls. They would just, meet in the morning and say, "Did you hear what Limbaugh said yesterday?" And that guy introduced him to Fox.
Mm.
So now my dad was like a completely different person.
Mm.
And he was arguing all the time with all of us. And at one point, he even disowned me because I had a personal ad that said, "No Republicans, please." I didn't have anything against Republicans before this. But then
Uh-huh.
I'm thinking, holy moly, this is what they are? No, thank you.
Right.
And
So interesting. Where did you grow up, or where did this radicalization occur? Just out of curiosity.
well, I grew up in West Long Branch, New Jersey, but then he moved to Maryland for his job.
I
But
see.
then he moved back when they retired, and then that's where he listened to Bob Grant. And in fact, my mother saw Bob Grant at the shopping mall one day,
Mm.
and he walked right past her, and she said to him, "You're Bob Grant, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Oh, my husband likes you, but I don't."
Well, love your mom.
I know. So yeah, well, now we'll get to my mom part of the story.
Please.
So also he got into emails. You know, he was just saturated 100%. He got these emails and he sent them out to all of us, and they, from the Heritage Foundation to Judicial Watch to you name it. And my mom would send these emails back saying that's not true, as she learned how to source and you know debunk things. But he didn't listen until one day they moved to a senior community, and in that move, my dad's radio broke. What a
Mm-hmm.
stroke of luck.
Mm-hmm.
So it just sat in the garage, and he couldn't listen to Limbaugh. And immediately, Steve, there was a softening in his personality. He was less angry immediately,
Yeah.
and he and my mom would sometimes eat lunch together again. And then I sometime later, I lost track of time, maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months later, I don't know. But the TV broke. It was an old TV, and they bought a new TV for the kitchen.
Yeah.
And my mom programmed the remotes, and he couldn't figure it out. So he stopped watching Fox.
So, can I interrupt and just
Yes.
say that I did a TEDx talk? How can I know if I've been brainwashed? And I told a little bit of my Mooney story, and I recommended 4 steps to reality test whether you've been brainwashed. And the first one is disconnect from
Mm,
all influences of the thing that you're questioning, whether it's a toxic person or a cult, political cult, therapy cult, religious cult. Just take a time out, come back to nature, listen to music, be with family and friends, because as soon as you stop the constant reinforcement, the brain goes back to normal to a large extent. So
yeah.
so you're describing step one of what I've learned in 47 years of helping people is if you want to think and reality test, disconnect. And then the other steps I can go into another time,
Right.
but it's learning about brainwashing and mind control, seeking out critics and former members,
Right.
hearing their point of view, and
Right.
then reflecting, going back in time to when you got involved
Yeah.
and asking yourself, if I knew then what I now know,
Yeah.
what would I do differently?
Yeah.
And if the answer is I never would have gotten involved, then you know it's time to leave.
Right.
It's a simple formula, but people need to understand it's not a permanent
Yeah.
mind virus.
It doesn't have to be.
It
No.
doesn't have to be.
And it
Exactly.
just also shows the power of media, the power of brainwashing, the power of propaganda. It shows the power. We are not that, we think we're all that as humans, but I think we're pretty malleable.
You,
Especially some humans, like my mother wasn't, but my dad was. Now, it wasn't because he was stupid. He
right.
had an engineering degree, but he had a different kind of maturity. Like my mom had an emotional maturity. My dad didn't have any kind of self-reflection. He just knew all the points were getting hit. Like, yes, that makes me angry. Yes, I'm no longer the head of the household. Um, oh, immigrants are taking over our jobs. Oh, Democrats want to take In God We Trust off the penny. You know what I mean?
Right.
Reactionary, reactionary.
Right.
Yeah.
But what I want to say to our listeners and why I want you to watch the documentary and read the book is you go into interviewing people who are involved with right-wing media. You explain this is very deliberate psychological kind of warfare stuff.
Absolutely.
And that's what makes your documentary not just a happy story of someone who was radicalized and got free and became himself again, but you explain this is intentional psychological warfare stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, uh, you know, that's why I did the movie. I wanted to figure out what's going on because it was really suspect to me that all of these messages from the emails, the snail mail, the what he would watch on TV and what he would listen to were all saying, they were all on point, they were all saying the same thing. And
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously I had a friend who moved to Texas, and she was changing the way he was around the same time. And one
Mm.
time they both said, well, no, it happened several times. They would both say the same exact thing to me. Like my dad, I visited them, and he said, there's no such thing as organic. And I was trying to think, well, what does he mean by that? But I didn't want to get into it. So,
Right.
and then I came back to New York. My friend visited me. We were having breakfast, and she said, there's no such thing as organic.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this is an echo chamber. So I became suspicious. So I wanted to find out what was going on. I did research and I found out it was intentional. And and then when I did the book, I went back even further because I would read like Nancy McLean's book, Democracy in Chains, and shows
Right.
like what happened in the 50s. And then uh, uh, oh my God, I forget all of a sudden. My books are over there. Shadow Networks. Uh,
Yeah, Ann Nelson
Ann
Shadow
Nelson.
Network about the Council for National Policy. Uh-huh.
Right, right. I found out about all of these other influences as well. So that then I included that in the book. But basically, the Lewis Powell memo lays it all out. Like they started in the 50s, uh, and I think it was after Brown v. Board of Education.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Somebody didn't like that. I'm over 60, so I'm forgetting names just because I'm not.
It's okay. I'm over 62 and I forget names too. But what I want our
James Mc.
listeners to know is you
Yeah,
really did due diligence and
yeah,
research, and you have people on camera talking about
yeah,
their activities.
yeah,
Share a little bit more about the specifics that you
yeah,
think people
yeah,
should know.
yeah. Okay, so the name I was trying to think of was James McGill Buchanan, who was an economist back then.
Uh huh.
And when Brown v. Board of Education happened, he was a really rich person. He got very angry about that. And it was bad enough that he had to pay for kids to go to public school. But now here we're having little black kids, having to go. So he hooked up with Koch. It was Fred Koch, I think, one of the Koch, of the
Yeah, wasn't
Kochs.
he co-founder of the John Birch Society, Fred
Exactly,
Koch?
exactly. So
And
that's
Koch
but
is behind fire and all this free speech nonsense, which is really not about free speech. It's
right.
about trying to create a propaganda channel for disinformation to cause chaos and confusion,
Yeah.
from my point of view.
Oh no, absolutely. And they were behind the Tea Party as well.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, speed forward. I guess the most important thing to me that I found was the Lewis Powell memo,
Mm.
which was Lewis Powell was hired by. He was a corporate lawyer, and he was hired by James Snyder from the business. I just hate that I'm forgetting names. But anyway, he was hired to write up like sort of a big plan for how to bring the country back into corporate influence,
Mm-hmm.
and how to, because there was all the civil rights, like I was talking, and anyway, yeah, there was the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and then all these people that were protesting against Vietnam,
Right.
and business people and are freaking out. And they're like, you know,
Business people, but people like Koch who want oil and they don't want legislation to
right,
restrict, fossil fuel production, and people who are racist and people who are patriarchal, Christian nationalists. Women should, have
yeah,
aprons on and they shouldn't be, going to work.
yeah, yeah. First it started out just these rich guys, like plutocrats
Mm-hmm.
that didn't want to. They were resentful ever since FDR.
Yes, they didn't like going off the gold standard. I'll just quote my friend and colleague Dave Troy as a great podcast that tracks back all of this conspiracy, and it's not a conspiracy theory, it's an actual conspiracy of wealthy people to
Yeah,
want
it
to
is.
manipulate the public and laws.
And Steve, that was one thing in my book I really just wanted to, in my movie, I wanted to drum in like, hey, guys, you want a conspiracy theory? This is the real thing. This is a real conspiracy theory. But I
This isn't a
remember
theory though, it's a
it's a
conspiracy.
real conspiracy.
Right.
And I felt like people were looking for a conspiracy because they're wondering, why am I working two jobs? Why does my wife have to work or my husband have to work? Why aren't my kids getting a good education? So they're looking for answers.
Right.
So here the right comes along with ready made conspiracy theories. And they're they are banking with the wrong
Well, they're
ones.
distracting people. They understand social psychology.
Yeah,
And one of the big techniques I wrote in The Cult of Trump is projection onto the other and making people fearful of the other.
right.
But in fact, they're talking about their own behavior.
Yeah,
You know?
and it's blame and divide.
Yes,
You know,
polarize, right?
right? Like, let's blame. Mainly, it was all under the umbrella of Democrats because
Mm.
all these people that weren't rich and powerful, you know, you had blacks, you had minorities, other minorities, you had poor people,
Let's add the
all
gay
voted.
folks too,
Yeah,
please.
the gay folks, and they, what did they voted Democrat. So well, how do we get them to not vote Democrat and vote against their own interests, vote Republican?
Yeah.
So yeah, the Lewis Powell memo, to me, that lays it all out.
Hmm.
Um,
We'll add a link to that in our blog when we write up and embed this video
yeah,
for those who are listening in the podcast. There'll be
yeah,
and you can also look it up.
right, yeah.
So please, I remember Frank Luntz was interviewed in your film, Words That Work, Frank Luntz.
Yeah,
And
I couldn't believe I got Frank once. He was actually really, really nice, and I mean, that doesn't mean he was a good person, but
well,
he
he
was
was
very
working
nice.
on whoever wanted to pay him. I did see him messaging for the vaccine during the
Yeah,
COVID pandemic.
yeah, he
That
kind
was,
of knew what he was doing.
yeah.
Yeah, but he also wanted footage that I had for his own uh, this like class that he was forming, you
I
know.
see.
And so that was, I think, why you said no. But also, we worked with Matthew Modine, the wonderful actor. He also did. He co-narrated the film with me,
Hmm.
and Frank. Actually, Matthew had gone to Frank Luntz to help him with some wording about something because Frank Luntz is the master, you
Right.
know. And
Death
so
tax was his, right? And what?
yeah, the death tax, yeah, clear
Didn't he do
skies.
Citizens United also, which was like a flip on the fact let's give corporations power to do dark money contributions?
Yeah, just about anything that means the opposite.
Yeah, it's straight out of
He
double speak,
did.
of
Yeah,
Orwell, right?
yeah, and so anyway, yeah, he really liked Matthew a lot, and so he also did it for Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
But Matthew's like a saint. He was like a really good person.
Mm-hmm.
But so yeah, there was Frank Luntz, who understood language and understood its power. And I remember listening to NPR in the mornings and hearing words that I knew somebody, I didn't know about Frank Luntz at the time. Somebody made them up in order to poke Democrats.
Mm.
And then I would hear Democrats repeat the same words that I knew were setups. Like, just for instance, like renaming the Democratic Party the Democrat Party. Like, that was meant to diss Democrats.
Mm.
Um, Democratic sounded like they were um, sounded like they had agency over democracy or something like that, and
Mm-hmm.
they didn't like that. Also, Democrat rhymed with autocrat, plutocrat, and then rat. So they got that in, and now I can't hear it. I can't believe it, but I hear Democrats saying the Democrat Party because they repeat, 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 as you know.
It's so sad, and my work is trying to educate the public how mind control works, and of course, that's part of it is information manipulation,
Right.
not only deception, but using loaded language that's thought terminating, all or nothing, good versus evil, us versus them.
Right.
And of course, words change how you think
Right.
in a
Right.
not a good way.
And framing.
Yes.
He who frames first, that frame lasts longer,
Yep.
no matter what the facts turn out to be. So,
Yeah. Are you familiar with Robert Cialdini's work? He wrote a book called Influence. It's one of the most, respected books on influence. He did a follow-up book called Persuasion, and it's all about framing, or also known as priming.
oh,
You
really?
set the frame, and then
Yeah,
if people enter your frame, you're controlling it
right,
versus,
right.
talking openly from
Yeah,
different points of view.
yeah, and it's a lot more subtle.
Yes.
People don't realize, like, oh, Republicans just framed that issue, so that it appears one way when it's really another way.
Yep. And
But
a lot of it's emotional manipulation. You know,
that's yeah.
people like to think we're rational, but we're emotional, and we rationalize. But
Luntz said it's 80% emotion, um, and
hmm
another person who understood that it was emotion was Roger Ailes,
yes.
who actually created Fox.
Yep.
And he understood language somewhat too, but he understood emotion.
Yes.
And he wanted to have that emotion, which is one of the means of influence, brainwashing.
Absolutely. So I
Yeah.
want to mention, I hope you don't mind, I did an interview with a Boston College historian who wrote a book called Nazis in Copley, The Forgotten History of the Christian Front. And this is a book about the Nazis in the 30s and how Father Coughlin had a radio show with 30 million people. He was an anti Semite, Nazi
Mm-hmm.
sympathizer if he wasn't outrightly paid by the Nazis. But in this book, Gallagher is his name, talked about a Nazi spy who was here to organize and militarize a militia to do a physical coup in 1940 to keep the U.S. out of World War II. But here's the reason I'm bringing it up is this guy did his doctoral dissertation in 1932 at the University of Munich on how to use emotions to manipulate minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't even have to be rational if you're using emotion, and that's one thing that I noticed on Fox. In the early days, was like these people are acting really angry, and I could tell that it was fake, but I'm very perceptive,
Right.
um, and not a lot of people can tell when they're being faked. I'm like, what's this all about? And then so the person that people tend to emulate what they're watching. They
Sure.
they they yeah, actually, like, when I watch a movie, I find that I'm making the same faces.
Well, that's
Yeah,
that's part of the human experience. We have mirror
yeah,
neurons, and that's why it's so important to choose your sources carefully
right,
and to also keep your critical thinking there so that you
yeah,
don't just go with the flow and all of a sudden beliefs are being put into your head that you never chose to have.
right. It was just totally different from Walter Cronkite.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up with my parents watching Walter Cronkite. Just steady, boring, but he was still warm. But he
Yep.
didn't he didn't use emotion or feign emotion. It was about the news. So here you have these people, like, particularly on Fox, but talk radio is just as bad, if not worse, because it reaches more people
Yeah.
across the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but yeah, on Fox, I noticed that they would act really angry and be really passionate, and, like, sometimes even pound their fist. And you're thinking, wait, here's these people in suits sitting behind desks. It's called news. They're professionals. Something must really be wrong
Mm-hmm.
for these newscasters to be that angry I got to find out what this is about. And
Mm.
it gets you angry, it gets you fearful.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of like hooked in. And I believed that my dad was addicted to the anger.
Mm.
It was exciting for him. It gave him purpose. He
Mm.
was retired. He didn't work on the car anymore. He didn't fix radios anymore.
Mm.
What did he do? He got all pissed off. That's
Mm.
what he did.
Mm.
And this was like a new cause for him. And, he could walk around with some feeling of righteousness and like he knew, and like, this is my tribe. These are my buddies. I belong. I'm important. They make me feel important. Um, yeah, so it starts with emotion.
Yeah, and I dare to say the cult of Trump, although this was a cult before Trump even showed up on the national political
Right,
scene.
right. I think Trump just, uh, I think that the Republican Party was still somewhat constrained. But once Trump came into power and he had no constraints and just said what people were thinking, what those Republicans were thinking, and saw how people loved that because they had already been primed. They had already been primed. If Trump came out even 15 years ago,
Mm.
I think it would have been too much. But they had already had like 30, 40 years of, like, I'm really angry. And here's someone who's finally saying what I'm angry about. So he kind of broke the Overton window.
Yeah.
You know,
Do you know about Mark Burnett and the Seven Mountain Dominionist
I
cult?
yeah, not a lot, but I've heard
Well,
of
he's
it.
the one
Go
who
ahead.
chose Trump to be on The Apprentice and made
Oh,
him
that's
into a
right.
celebrity.
Right.
He spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast of the Cult of Family that
Yeah.
Jeffrey Charlotte did the Netflix series and two good books about.
Yeah.
And but this is Christian right. These are people who want to take over, and they want to take over government and religion and family and business and technology and media, etc. Again, a conspiracy of people who are not invested in human rights and women's rights and gay rights and religious separation of church and state. They want to take over and impose their version of Christian nationalism.
They were odd bedfellows,
Mm.
but they pretty much had the same goal, just like the Wednesday meetings that they had. And where it's like, if you are anti-tax, anti-abortion, and pro-gun, we're going to pitch whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it was a joining of like oil barons, uh, the plutocrats or the
Libertarians.
libertarian,
And
right
I
wing
would add the
libertarians. Yeah,
Manhattan Declaration, which was a first time ever joining of Catholic extremists and Protestant esque extremists agreeing to go after women's right to choose their health care, gay rights, and to impose their version of religious freedom on everybody else.
yeah,
This was an agreement in writing. It's on the web. People can
yeah,
read it, and all the
yeah,
signatories to this.
yeah. I mean, I can't believe I knew they wanted to go like back in time, 1900s maybe, but it seems like they even just want to reduce women to second class citizens. I wouldn't be surprised if they try and take away the right to vote at some point for women to vote. What do you think?
I
I
don't
mean,
think
that
it'll
just,
happen that they'll take away the right to women to vote. Maybe in certain states, if they
yeah,
wind up destroying the power of the federal government,
yeah,
then they'll have their fiefdom in Florida or wherever else. But I don't know. I'm Jewish, and I grew up um, educated about the Holocaust, and then I got recruited into a fascist cult that said the Holocaust was justified and democracy was satanic, and I became a leader in this. And then when I nearly died and then was deprogrammed, I was like, how did I ever believe this nonsense and this crap? And that's
Yeah.
what has generated me to spend so many years to try to warn people, hey, I'm an intelligent, educated person from a good family. I got radicalized, and
Right.
but now we're seeing all these millions of Americans who are radicalized, and
Right.
people around the world who are being radicalized
Yeah.
through the use of social media and other media.
So how bad do you think it will get? I mean, I'm surprised that there's states all over that are trying to take away rights, take away voting rights. I mean, they're doing it in certain states.
Yes, so my friend Frederick Clarkson, a
Hmm.
journalist who's been following the right wing for decades, in fact, he
Hmm.
interviewed me when I first got out of the Moonies. He became aware of their plan called Project Blitz, which was exactly to try to undo the presidential election by going state electors and then infiltrating school boards and state legislatures, etc. And he is part of something, it's still going, called Blitz Watch.
Mm.
And but it's bad, but there's more of us, and but we need to understand the nature of the danger correctly, not get distracted, understand the bad actors
Hmm.
who are pouring huge sums of money, and they took over the Supreme Court, as we well know,
Yeah.
through Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society.
Right.
um, so we really, really, really need to have a supermajority win in next year in the election, and then we have a chance to maybe expand the Supreme Court, or do a congressional thing to put term limits in. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I don't
Yeah.
feel like there's an option to be a pessimist or to get hopeless. Like, I
Yeah.
really feel like, for the sake of our children and our grandchildren, for the sake of the planet, for the sake of all the people who don't have a
Right.
platform to speak to
Yeah.
large audiences, we have to
Right.
do what we can.
Right. And I guess, my question was going to be what can we do? Um, and one of those things is to get everybody, to vote. But what concerns me is, like, Texas making it so that in that one county, the Democratic county, if there's just one question about the election, some idiot just has to say, oh, well, I think it was rigged. And then,
We know
you
that
know,
there's always going to be that if they don't get the person they want in. But I really believe the answer is, I'm going to use a word I don't like, but deprogramming, like educating people about how to understand the influence continuum. This is ethical influence, this is unethical influence, the bite model of authoritarian control, and how it breaks down people and builds them up in the image of the cult, and mobilizing former members, former neo Nazis, former MAGA trolls like David Weissman, who I wrote about in my book, and Botcha Goldberg, and destigmatizing, um, having believed in the cult of Trump and that
right.
whole thing. I would also say that everybody that I meet knows somebody who got radicalized, whether it's
Yes.
an aunt, an uncle, a
Yes.
grandparent, a friend from high school.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of people just got fed up with being sent all of the propaganda, and they blocked or cut off or tried to argue and called their family member or friends names. And I've been saying from the beginning, that's the worst thing to do. That's what the controllers want,
Right.
is a polarization. To say, I care about you, I respect you, I want to understand you. If I've said something that hurt your
Hmm.
feelings, forgive me.
Hmm.
Can we
Now,
please do a redo? Can we discuss? You
yeah.
know, and but the focus has to be on mind control, not on policies. It has
Right.
to, and what I find works is talking about Chinese communist brainwashing or pimp and trafficker mind control and how
What's
they
that? Pimping.
pimp,
Oh, oh,
pimp,
oh, oh, I got it. Oh,
traffickers,
yeah, yeah,
sex
yeah.
trafficking, and labor
That's
trafficking.
right. It happens
They
here
use
too.
the
Yeah.
bite model. It's a mind control cult
Right.
situation.
Right.
But if you attack the leader, the doctrine, and the policy straight on, you get that defensive
Right.
self, that's the true believer,
Sure.
and they feel persecuted. And that's
Right.
part of the
And it's a
programming.
challenge to their identity and who
Right,
they are, and that's a really scary thing.
right.
So it has to
But
not be
I believe
scary.
we can teach people. It seems like everybody has been had some experience with a
Every.
multi-level marketing group or a malignant narcissist that they
Yeah.
fell in love with and were abused, or some CEO who was a malignant narcissist. Sharing personal experiences in a warm, respectful way and
Hmm.
asking questions that evokes people to start reflecting and reality testing is
Right.
what my prescription is. And messaging. And I
Yeah.
really, I really have a problem with people who say, oh, those stupid MAGA
I
people,
do
those
too.
idiots.
Yeah. That doesn't
Why
do
are you
anybody any good.
it riles up
It doesn't. It
their
just.
supporters, but
Yeah.
that's not going to help us get out of the mess we're in. Like having an
Right.
understanding that we're all human beings
Right.
sharing a planet together
Yeah.
and that our survival depends on cooperation, not
Yeah.
on elitists,
Yeah.
trying to, suppress others.
I think people get confused when we say that. They think that they're saying we've got to love them and we have to hang out with them and and forgive maybe what they do, but that's not really
That's
what
not what
you're
I'm
saying.
suggesting.
Yeah.
But hanging out with them, watching a basketball game together, having a
Hmm.
picnic, going fishing, definitely. Especially if you did that before they got radicalized. Because that's
Yeah.
going to activate their real self.
Right.
Showing them videos
Yeah.
and pictures of happy times together when you were close and
Yeah.
reminiscing, that's going to activate the person's authentic self too.
Now, what about when you meet someone online? I know people that meet somebody online, like maybe they're on Facebook and there's a right winger that says something that's obviously really wrong or inflammatory. And then I have friends that will try to respond. Uh, what do you think?
Well, so a lot of what's going on online are bots. So one needs, you need to know there's a real person that has an
Hmm.
actual like career or like a real identity, etc.
Hmm.
And if you have the time and the interest, you can say, mind if I ask you some questions?
Hmm.
Then they may say, go ahead.
Yeah.
And what I like to do, for example, if it's about Trump, I like to say is, what's your earliest memory of Donald Trump? And then you be quiet and wait for them to think about it. When I do that, people say, oh, I saw him on The Apprentice, or I remember he was cheating on his wife, or,
Hmm.
molesting women, or whatever. That's really interesting. That's your first memory. So walk me through when you started to take him seriously as a candidate.
And what typically or what has happened?
Well, the idea is to get people to reflect, because people get into this influence chain and they
Right.
forget What was your first thought, or what was your first feeling? I like to ask people that I counsel who come out of cults, religious cults, and of
Yeah.
all types. What was your first feeling, or what did you first think when that recruiter came up to you? And they often say, "Oh, I thought it was a scam, or I thought it was a cult." And I'm like, "Aha, that's really interesting," because you want to anchor and reinforce.
Hmm.
Yeah, you had an actual reaction. Now
Yeah.
walk me through, what was it that's got you starting to pay attention?
So if it's Trump and you ask them, what's your earliest uh, memory or image that you can
I've never
recall,
heard
then,
anybody that I've interacted with say a positive first memory of Trump.
oh, well, when they say The Apprentice, are they
They
meaning
they watched The
positively?
Apprentice, but they didn't necessarily like him.
Oh, okay. So that's
They
what you're,
thought it was really entertaining, and he was bombastic and
yeah,
spoiled, a rich,
yeah.
arrogant something, but they
Hmm.
didn't say, "Oh, I wanted to be Donald Trump."
Yeah.
For
Okay. So by invoking their first memory, more than likely it's not going to be a good one.
the point is it's different for every person, but I would
Yeah.
say that the most important approach is
Yeah.
warm, respectful curiosity, where
Yeah.
you're asking questions that make the person really think,
R- Right.
reflect on
Right.
things. And you can start it out by saying, "I'm curious if you're open to me asking some questions," because they
Right.
might say, blah, no, you're an asshole, Steve,
Yeah.
which I do get online. Um, and I'll often get, people attacking me. "Steve, you're in the cult of Soros and you've been brainwashed by the libtards." And
Yeah.
my reaction is, "Oh, really? Tell me more."
Well, they accused me of Soros funded my film. I'm like, it would be a lot prettier, a lot more sophisticated if Soros funded my film.
Yeah. But the
Yeah.
point is rather than get defensive, which is what, in a sense, they want.
Hmm.
They want to arouse you.
Hmm.
I'm like, "I'm brainwashed. Tell me what brainwashing is. Fascinating."
Socratic questioning.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 And then I go into my story, which is why I think there's so many people with powerful personal stories if they're willing to
Yeah.
you know
Like
educate
like my
themselves
dad.
how to describe it.
Yeah.
That's why I love your documentary and your
Yeah.
book.
Yeah, and you had your own experience with it, and I had my documentary.
Yeah, and
But
almost nobody thinks the Moonies was cool, or that Sun Myung Moon was the Messiah, and that
yeah,
Jesus failed, and all kinds of other crap that he espoused. So when people meet
yeah,
me and they realize, hey, he's pretty
yeah.
smart and he's educated, how could he fall for the Moonies?
I,
I get
I,
to share my story and plant some seeds, hopefully.
yeah. I had some friends. I think I might have introduced you to them. Hear yourself think. They were early. They early on they contacted me too, but they live in Red, Pennsylvania, and they started out as knocking on doors, like getting people to vote for the local Democrat
Mm-hmm.
or what have you. And I think they framed it as like what happens is when you get all the fear and the anger delivered at you, that the amygdala goes into the fight or flight syndrome.
Sure.
And so what you are doing is you're deactivating it. Once you deactivate that fight or flight, I got to run, this is danger to my survival, um, then you can find some common ground.
Well, that's the key, is finding common ground.
Yeah.
Letting them see you as a human being. You're a parent. I'm a parent too. Or
Yeah. Puppies.
you like puppies. I have one. I have a fluffy one. What's your dog's name? My dog's
Right.
name is Sophie.
yeah,
Get to the human level and then engage, but in a
yeah,
way where you are displaying you're open to being persuaded
yeah,
is the critical thing. If you're taking a judgmental kind of tone that you need to be like me and believe what I believe, that they're going to shut down in a minute. But if you're
right,
like, hey, you seem really smart, I respect you, tell me your journey, maybe I'll
yeah,
change my mind,
yeah,
then they have investment to
yeah,
really be sincere and
yeah.
engage.
So, I mean, so that's another way that we can fight back is for everybody to try and engage somehow, um, with somebody.
Well, stop
But,
doing the attacking and the name calling and the
hmm
polarizing and start with somebody you actually know that you may have blocked or
mm,
muted and just say, hey, I
yeah,
miss you. How you doing?
yeah,
I came across this photo of us together that we were 20 years ago,
hmm
and I miss you.
hmm
And then if they come back and say, I'm angry at you because you called me
hmm
names, you get to apologize and
yeah,
ask for a do over.
yeah. And in my world, I focus on the media because I feel that, the media is largely at fault because it's so influential. Again, nobody
Yep.
wants to admit, like, but I mean that's why they spend billions on advertising every year for,
Yep.
2 minutes, 3 minutes, because it influences.
Yep.
So I'm uh, I'm hopeful in that now I see, since when COVID was happening, I was screening my movie a lot. And a
Yep.
lot of the groups that had once been maybe for Elizabeth Warren or focused on something else, now they're focused on media.
Mm.
And they do various things, like maybe they'll criticize the New York Times one day because they had a both sides headline,
Mm-hmm.
and then I have these friends that are Truth Tuesdays, and they um, demonstrate in front of Fox every
Mm-hmm.
Tuesday. So I do see fighting back. It's scary to me because it seems like they're just unleashed. Like after Trump lost the election, now it's like no holds barred, and you have um, Rhonda, I call him Rhonda,
Mm.
Ron DeSantis,
Right.
what he's done in Florida.
Yeah, Trump
But
2.0, but
yeah,
not. But I
and
like is it Clara Atkin who goes after advertisers and who may not be
Nandini,
aware that they're paying money to promote hate.
yeah. And who did you say?
I think her name is Claire Atkin. She has a small organization, but she goes for the money. She goes
It's
to
yeah.
tell people who spend money on advertising, hey, your brand is getting tarnished
As
dramatically. Are you aware of this?
I think
Uh,
she's hooked up with another woman. I can remember her first name, Nandini, right? And
Maybe.
they have actually gotten advertisers to like
Oh,
block some.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, money is still very important, and
hmm
I was just listening this morning to a report about how something like $89 million was fraudulently raised in the name of veterans and police and fire officials for political nonprofits, but it was all going to pay them and nothing to actually help firefighters and police and veterans, which
Who was behind it? Who was behind
they
it?
the report, I think it was in the New York Times, named the people, but the important thing is don't
Yeah.
just respond to robocalls and people are powerful charismatic voices
Yeah.
that are recorded to persuade you even to give $30 times 10,000 people is a lot of money,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it was fraud. And
Yeah.
if something is legitimate, find out, do your research, and send them a
Yeah.
check, or
Yeah.
do direct
If
pay,
you want to.
donation to them.
Yeah. There's a lot of that going on. Yeah.
Yep. And so we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes. So what else would you like to say to our listeners other than I want to tell people check out the book Jen Senko, The Brainwashing of My Dad, and
Thank
I
you.
love the documentary. So if you're
Thank
into
you.
film, watch the documentary then read the book.
And I say check out this book,
Thank you.
which is also really good. It says the cult of Trump, but what it really is, like, it just uses Trump as an example and goes into Trump, but it's really about a lot of the things that are in my book, but you expound on them.
Yeah.
You know, about
Yeah, I try to say
brainwashing.
that Trump was is being used, but this has been a 50-year
Yeah,
conspiracy of people
right.
and understanding Bernays and
Yeah,
understanding
right.
psychological
Yeah,
warfare, fourth generation warfare that
yeah.
William Lind wrote about
Yeah.
in the 80s, and he paired up with Paul Weyrich
Oh,
and the Council for National Policy
Rich was a bad guy.
yeah,
Woo.
and Lynn met with Trump directly when he was in the White House.
Oh,
So
really?
this is psychological warfare, attacking experts, attacking institutions, attacking science to
Right,
create distrust and fear so that
right,
people be more likely to respond to an authoritarian who says, "I
right,
know what we need to do.
right.
Trust me."
And to hate Democrats so much that whether they represent policies that would be good for you or not, you're not going to vote for them. You're going to vote Republicans because they painted themselves as the saving angels.
Yeah, the demonization of the other is the technique. And I'll
Mm-hmm.
just cite Eric Hoffer's 1954 book, The True Believer, where he said the
Mm-hmm.
strength of a mass movement can be
Mm-hmm.
measured by the tangibility and vividness of its devil. You know,
You remember a lot of quotes. I
well,
envy your memory.
I'm better with quotes than names of people, but we all have our strengths and
Yeah,
such. I actually think I got a better memory after doing my doctoral dissertation on updating the law for
yeah,
undue influence. That's another thing that needs to happen, especially in this age of AI,
yeah,
where they're saying, "How do we fix this?" or "How do we get rails on this?"
yeah,
And I have a scientific model that looks at behavior, information, thought, and emotional control as four variables.
right,
And we could definitely program computers to look for human rights
yeah,
and whether or not people are being, forced into a black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil ideology, or
yeah,
look for thought terminating cliches. Of
yeah,
course, for me, it can apply to the left or the right. It isn't just the right, but
yeah,
we want to educate people to be good
right,
citizens, good
right.
consumers.
One quick other quick question is, you've actually deprogrammed people,
Yeah.
and I just want to point that out. And how often do you do that?
I'm really shifting at age 69 to training other clinicians. I have a course on my web page now, freedomofmind.com, and I'm doing less. I'll do, consult for 30 minutes or a 60-minute on Zoom these days, and occasionally I will meet people in person to do a more intensive recovery
Yeah,
set of consultations, counseling. But I do want to add that QAnon is a psyop and a cult. It is
right.
not a conspiracy theory. It was a deliberate,
Yeah,
intentional psychological warfare device that
yeah,
caught so many people, including Marjorie Taylor Greene
yeah,
and Ginny Thomas.
yeah,
People need to understand that even bright, talented lawyers and others can be co-opted
right. And
into
that's,
this extremism,
yeah, and that's why we have to really be aware of it.
anti-rational. Jen
Yeah.
Senko, thank you for being you. Thank you for sharing your dad's story and for educating us. And again, The book is The Brainwashing of My Dad, based on the award-winning documentary. And I hope we get to meet in person someday soon.
I know, I know. I hope so too.
Great.
Thank, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.